Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in our second webinar in the series. We are so happy to have you. Last week, we had Professor the Honorable Errol Morrison, who talked about Innovate for a Green Future. And we're continuing with that theme even today. And we have our Executive Director, Ms. Leclerc Bellamy, sitting right beside me. And we also have a very interesting presenter this morning, the person of Mrs. Lalita Davis Mattis, and she is the head of the legal unit at University of the West Indies, Mona campus, and she's also University Counsel. She has done extensive work in international law, environmental law, and Caribbean environmental law. So we're very happy this morning, and we're in for a very exciting presentation. And we are happy that you were able to join us this morning. Mrs. Mattis, over to you.
Good morning. Are you hearing me?
Yes, good morning. We're hearing you.
Hi, yes. We had quite a bit of tech troubles this morning. So
Yes,
it is my pleasure to be here.
yes, we're happy to have you.
And I'm really happy to be here. And I really want to congratulate the Jamaica Intellectual Property Office for all this wonderful work, right? I'm just trying to get into my presentation. And do I get right into it?
No, 1 second. We soon allow you to go straight into it. We just want to introduce you properly.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So Mrs. Lalita Davis Mattis is the University Counsel and Head of Legal Unit at University of the West Indies. She's also Environmental Law Lecturer at the Faculty of Law, UWI Mono. She has done extensive work in international law, Caribbean international environmental law, and many more. So we're pleased to have Mrs. Mattis today. And as I said before, beside me, we have our Executive Director, Mr. Leclerc Bellamy, who will be part of this discussion today.
Thanks so much, Chantal. It's my pleasure to be here as we continue this webinar series that's focusing on the theme for Intellectual Property Day 2020. Intellectual Property Day was celebrated on the 26th of April. We're in a really different time period right now in that we're dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, which has really brought to the fore the importance of our environment, the environment in all of its aspects, our built environment, the environment in terms of the accessibility to water, and basically the sun, which we have been told is very important now in helping to keep us healthy. So all of these issues are things that touch on concern on intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights really provide the bedrock for our development. And even though we may not be aware and recognize how intellectual property impacts on our lives, it is an important and critical area. So our focus today is on the environment, and we are really pleased at JICO to have Mrs. Davis Mattis be our speaker today, and we hope that you will be able to contribute and ask questions, and that this will be a fruitful endeavor. So over to you, Mrs. Davis Mattis.
All right, thank you. So as Lily Claire just said, we are talking about intellectual property rights. We're talking about environmental rights as well. And so my presentation this morning is going to be a little bit eclectic because I just want to touch on a number of things that touch and concern the environment as well as intellectual property. And so I'm just going to be reminding us in terms of what the environment is. But before I do that, I just want to define the environment. We're going to talk about what is intellectual property. We're going to talk about IP-related matters as they relate to the environment, community rights, which is a big deal for us in Jamaica. We'll touch on biodiversity, traditional knowledge. Of course, we'll look at the international framework and a little touch on the trade-related aspects of intellectual property, just a little bit there. So what is the environment? So I decided to use the definition from the Belize Environment Protection Act. And for their purposes, it says environment includes water, hosts, seas, air, and land, and the interrelationship which exists among and between water, air, and land, and human beings, other living creatures, plants, microorganisms, and property. And of course, it says includes. So we know that this is a very extensive definition of the environment and practically includes almost everything. In terms of the intellectual property rights, now, of course, I'm with the experts, so I won't even purport to speak on this topic very extensively. But just to remind us all, as we all know, intellectual property rights are rights given to persons over their creations of their mind. So when I talk about community rights, I suppose at the onset we can see what the challenges are in terms of a community of persons owning intellectual property as opposed to one person owning intellectual property. And the whole notion of what a community is a community, a group of persons in one locality, or can we have a community of persons in a larger space? So let's take Jamaica. Can we have a community of persons, some who live in Westmoreland, some who live in St. Thomas, and some who live in Clarendon, but those persons form a community, or the community of which we speak. And then community rights, which has to do with, as I said, knowledge belonging to a particular community of persons. And do we protect the community rights? And if the answer is in the affirmative, how do we actually do that? In terms of Jamaica, when we talk about community rights, we're really talking about community rights as relates to our indigenous communities. And I think that's also a very global concept. But again, when we talk about Jamaica and we talk about indigenous communities, what are we talking about? So we look at some of the international arrangements, and then we'll talk about indigenous communities, and then you'll also talk about communities. So for purposes of Jamaica, and I'm quoting from Dr. Marcus Goff in a paper, and we talk about our Maroon and Rastafari peoples, two communities with significant similarities and differences. And these two communities, of course, are increasingly making demands for recognition of cultural and intellectual property rights from the government of Jamaica. So we know that for purposes of this discussion, we will focus on these two groups as indigenous communities. So what are indigenous communities looking for? They're seeking also to effectively manage and control the commercialization and commodification of their respective cultures by members and non-members of their communities, both nationally and internationally. And I want to just pause here. When I articulated the definition of environment, it never necessarily included culture, but we really cannot divorce culture from environment. And if we look, for example, at the Barbados Program of Action, which of course was declared some years ago, right after Rio, we recognize that there are statements in that declaration that put our culture and our environment hand in hand, because people cannot be divorced from their culture, as we know Marcus Garvey is saying. But it's a reality when we talk about the environment, the cultural values, for example, that we place on the environment. So we really cannot separate them. For example, we can talk about, when we talk about the Maroons and the Rastafari communities, we talk about herbal medicine, for example, especially where the Maroons are concerned. And there are many songs, for example, that we even know. If you think about the song, Elena Anamuma Guagrong, Elena Start Up Ball for Your Belly. Maybe some of our listeners are too young to know that song, but it really speaks of a kind of an oral tradition that would have come down in song. And then Elena went home and they boiled sorosy for her belly. So in a real sense, that is a traditional knowledge being translated in song. And so there are certain plants and herbs that we have come to know as, or from an oral tradition, as being good or effective on certain illnesses. So initially, this kind of knowledge was owned by communities. In fact, many of these plants and these herbal knowledges actually came from the Africans when they were taken here and enslaved. And so they came to Jamaica and also saw similar plants, so they knew what it was about. And so the oral tradition came down, but then some of these herbs and their uses have become part of the public domain. And then herein also lies the challenge when we talk about rights to this environmental information, because in a real sense, it's understanding your biodiversity. It's community people understanding the use of a particular type of biodiversity, how an ecosystem works. And we understand that. We know, for example, when it comes down to, say, fisheries, that fisher folk also understand the art of fishing, not just the art of fishing, but the associated ecosystem. They know, you may say to a fisherman, the storm is coming and you need to come in. They know what to do. So there is a necessity for science and traditional knowledge to intersect. And globally, that is happening, and that is also happening through many of our international agreements. So again, one of our challenges for community knowledge is the notion that much of this is now in the public domain. And I also want to note here that as we get into the international arrangements, the whole notion of access to genetic resources and benefit sharing becomes very important, because many times we share our knowledge in a very flippant way. So at the end of the day, that is how the knowledge gets into the public domain. There are no benefits that accrue to the community with the knowledge. And I also want to note as well that on the one hand, whilst we want to retain that traditional knowledge in terms of use of resources, there is also the notion that because some resources, because of the whole global common and the common good, the common heritage of mankind, then that principle, the notion is that if we have indigenous material and the traditional knowledge that we know can be developed into pharmaceuticals that can cure diseases that will also affect us within the context of the common good and the common heritage of mankind. The international dialogue suggests that we should be sharing that knowledge, but bearing in mind the access and the benefit sharing arrangements. So in terms of our intellectual property and genetic resources, of course, we can talk about patents. And we know that the patent system recognizes innovations based on genetic resources and provides a framework for investment in the development of valuable new products and processes. And that's what we are talking about when we talk about the environment, because genetic resources, of course, will be had from the biodiversity that we have within our states, within our borders. And the extent to which we regulate that, the extent to which we recognize the value of our indigenous communities. And even if the communities don't qualify as indigenous communities, the extent to which we value the knowledge that is held by a particular community. The intellectual property, of course, again, offers the potential to yield benefits derived from these access issues. And so the need for us to really frame the dialogue and to frame the policy in such a way that our communities benefit, to frame the dialogue in such a way that when externals come in to our countries, and let's all assume it's going to be for good means, that we know how we are going to negotiate on behalf of, and therefore what role does the state play in that dialogue. So let's say a large pharmaceutical wants to come to Jamaica because the traditional knowledge relating to a particular plant species leads that particular pharmaceutical or research institution to believe that there are benefits to be derived. Hey, maybe this is a new cancer cure. How does the state address that? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the institutions to which they will come anyway? How do we regulate access to these communities and access to the intellectual property as well? Because if the intellectual property belongs to a community, in the same way in which an individual controls his or her intellectual property, you decide who you license it to. You decide what you do with it. How do we deal with community groups who we know have this information in groups, but also want to exploit that knowledge for their own benefit? So how does the state, what role does the state play? And we know that we are supposed to develop novel systems in order to protect these rights. I want to just give a little snippet on the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And Article 31 in particular speaks to the fact that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. So that is a right that this declaration is given to indigenous people. So zooming on Jamaica, these communities have rights. And again, how does the state interface with these rights? Because in essence, the biodiversity in a particular country, even though the plant is in a particular place, it could be endemic to a particular area, the biodiversity itself doesn't belong to the community, but the cultural heritage around it, the traditional knowledge belongs to the community. So again, you can see the dynamism that entails when we talk about issues of community knowledge, etc. In terms of the same declaration, it also says that they have rights to manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, etc., knowledge of the properties of fauna and flora, oral traditions, and so on. And of course, this presentation will be online, and these areas are highlighted for purposes of this discussion: the issue of genetic resources, seeds, medicines, etc. Now, so we have reached a point in this presentation where we have identified the fact that we also have these community rights. And so what are some of the international agreements? What's the international framework? And this is a very substantive topic. So I'm just going to focus a little bit on TRIPS, trade-related aspects of intellectual property, which to date is the most comprehensive multilateral agreement on intellectual property. So we talk about, on a TRIPS, we talk about trademarks. So when we develop these products and services, so let's say the communities have the rights and we give them the rights of which we speak. So in developing their products and services, will we allow them to develop products and services of themselves? Of course, the answer must be yes. The issue of trademarks, and then the issue also of labeling as well will come into play in all of this. So we talk about, for example, let's say we're talking about genetically modified organisms, for example, which is a different area, but also an environmental issue as well when we talk about the international framework. As we speak about the indigenous communities and community knowledge, we also can talk about geographical indications. So for example, let's pick up something out of the hat. Let's say the sorosy plant, as we know it, not the biological name, is found in a particular area, in a particular community. And you want to, under the TRIPS agreement, you want to ensure that those rights are enshrined and protected. Then geographical indications can also be a process that we can engage with respect to those plants and whatever comes of those plants. But because they're in a particular region, they're in a particular locality in terms of the quality, reputation, and characteristic of the good that is derived from the biodiversity that we're speaking to. One of the primary justifications, of course, for protection of geographical indications is to enable the producers, and I'm talking about the community producers, to secure premium prices, which are attracted by products which have that unique quality and attributable to their place of production. So as we talk about environment, intellectual property rights, because again, environment plays a very critical role when we talk about geographical indications. The application, for example, of GIs to agricultural products, of course, it provides consumer confidence in their purity as well as their traceability. So we are now talking about community rights, geographical indicators. So it becomes a very interesting topic with which we should engage if we really are going towards community rights, which we have already identified has its own challenges in terms of what are now the community rights as opposed to national rights. Because if the information is in the public domain, then the communities are now deprived of that opportunity to say, this is our right as a community because we alone hold that knowledge. The issue again of biodiversity and geographical indications, we can establish codes of practice, for example, which are collectively adopted by the community or the producer associations. And of course, that will lead to labeling as well as also incorporating biodiversity objectives in terms of the GIs. Now, just quickly again, in terms of the international framework, when we talk about the Nagoya Protocol, which comes under the Biodiversity Convention, and which speaks to access and benefit sharing, this becomes very important again within the context of Jamaica, particularly from a regulator perspective, because if you're talking about access to resources and benefit sharing, then I do submit that there must be some state intervention when it comes on to these issues, in terms of not necessarily the state wanting to dictate and prescribe necessarily, but so that the communities from which the resources are taken and the communities from which the traditional knowledge comes, that those communities actually benefit from all these negotiations and all these interfaces that we'll have between state and interested parties who are going to come in. So when you look at the protocol, we talk about research and development companies on biological materials of non-human origin. There are life sciences companies, for example, that deal with microorganisms, engineering of biodiversity, etc. So again, this too is now tied up back in the issue of so you come in and you have these products, but then that again can lead to genetically modified organisms. As I also always say to my class, you really don't know what you're eating, because much of what we're eating are genetically modified foods. The impact, of course, of genetically modified crops. So as I said, the discussion is a little eclectic because I'm picking from here and picking from there, because it's such a substantive area to discuss, that even the debate on GM foods is very complex as well. And when we talk, for example, about some agricultural crops that are so genetically modified that they withstand all manner of insects. So in other words, there have been concerns, for example, about the impact on human health of those products in and of themselves because of the degree and level of engineering and how they now affect us as human beings. Because there was an argument at one time, are we through, not all GM foods, some of these GM crops that are so engineered to withstand environmental factors, for example, insects, etc., that you have now created pesticides in and of themselves. And these are arguments that are being debated. So in a nutshell, in wrapping up, I just what I want us to take away from this is that when we talk about intellectual property rights, we're not just talking about musical compositions as we perhaps traditionally would want to think, patents in terms of technology and so on. But we are talking about real rights in biodiversity, rights in terms of knowledge, the fact that in this era of environmental management and protection and preservation, that we are also talking about community rights. So we are moving from individual to community rights and expanding the whole concept of intellectual property, which of course is internationally recognized. And so as we discuss and as we develop our procedures and we develop our novel procedures and novel policies, that as we go forward, that we must always remember the community rights. And I think there also is necessity for discussion with communities in terms of how you actually protect these rights. So the rights that are not in the public domain, the traditional knowledge that is in the public domain, we need to empower our communities how to keep this knowledge to themselves and how to exploit it for their own benefit within the context of an international legal framework, which already exists in terms of intellectual property and biodiversity within all these international and multilateral environmental agreements that we have entered into. So the last statement I want to make is that conventional forms of intellectual property rights are inadequate to protect traditional knowledge, which is all hinged on biodiversity protection as well, because they are based on protection of individual property rights. And I think I leave it there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Matthews, for your presentation. Over to our Executive Director, Ms. Bellamy, to add her bit in relation to intellectual property and the environment.
Well, thanks so much, Mrs. Davis Mattis. You have highlighted a number of important areas and areas that have been actually the focus of the Intellectual Property Office from in or around the year 2008. Um, the recognition that we have a lot of indigenous knowledge in Jamaica that is peculiar and specific to us as Jamaicans, recognizing the plurality of our society and all of the contributions that have come to Jamaica to make us who we are and what we are, and how this has contributed to our traditional knowledge, our traditional cultural expressions, and our genetic resources. Which one genetic resource that comes to mind immediately would be our ganja, which some have argued was brought from India, others have said came from the continent of Africa, and the work that we have done with that genetic resource in terms of actually having protected pharmaceuticals that were made from ganja. So two products come to mind, Canasol and Asmasol. Canasol for the treatment of diseases of the eyes and Asmasol for the treatment of asthma. But you made a point at the end, which I think is a very important point for us to focus on and to delve more into, which is probably an important point for the persons who are participating in this webinar. The intellectual property system recognizes that there is a lacuna between how do you protect the rights of local communities, and you mentioned two of our most famous local communities, our Rastafarian community and our Maroons. Those are two local communities that have contributed significantly to Jamaica. And in fact, worked at the Jamaica Intellectual Property Office, we worked closely with the World Intellectual Property Organization, where we had a number of seminars and activities with those two local communities, where they were provided with equipment to assist them in recording their traditional knowledge and their traditional cultural expressions. Jamaica has been working closely with the World Intellectual Property Organization on a committee called the Intergovernmental Committee on Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge, and Traditional Cultural Expressions. Basically, what that committee is trying to do is to give life to a provision in the Nagoya Protocol, which speaks to recognition of the intellectual property rights associated with traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and genetic resources. You alluded to the fact in terms of access and benefit sharing, obtaining prior informed consent. Because while you were speaking, we were discussing um, the fact that a number of Jamaicans, you go out into the garden and you pick a peppermint leaf and you have that minty for your breakfast, okay? Where do we get that knowledge from? And it is something that is common to nearly every Jamaican. If something is wrong with you, you think, okay, I might be getting a cold. You might do a concoction that includes our well-known geographical indication or Jamaican rum with some honey and lime, and you make a concoction and you drink it, and you feel magically
The
better.
pain.
Exactly. And in fact, the other day I was at a funeral in North America, and a Jamaican lady said to me, I was getting a cold, and she said, "It's okay, I have the cure for you." And I'm like, what is this lady going to do? She made me a cup of coffee, poured some rum in it, and some honey. And I'm like, I'm supposed to drink that? But I drank it, and it worked like a charm. So we have all of this traditional knowledge that has crossed generations. We have it in the diaspora and we have it here at home. So, in recognition of the fact that there was this vacuum, the Intergovernmental Committee of WIPO is trying to put in place a treaty or treaties that deal with it. Those discussions have been taking place for quite a number of years. We're now at the stage where we actually have a paper on traditional knowledge, one on traditional cultural expression, and one on genetic resources. But as you can imagine, Lalita, we have moved away from the recognition of the common heritage of mankind. Some argue that it's the common heritage of mankind, but the local communities and indigenous populations are of the mind that the common heritage of mankind is to their detriment. Because what happens is
Yes,
um,
I know.
the larger corporations utilize the resources. In fact, Professor Martin, who participated in our webinar last week, he shared a story with me regarding the Jamaican periwinkle or rainbow roses. That there was traditional knowledge that said that the rainbow roses could be used in the treatment of diabetes. But we actually discovered that what it could do was treat childhood leukemia. The point is, a drug was developed, but we did benefit from that drug. But that was decades ago. That, I think that was from the early 50s, I think, if memory serves me correctly. So what we're trying to do now is to reduce that imbalance. So if a local community or an indigenous population, or it could be an ordinary Jamaican whose mother told them that if you use this plant in this way, your hair will grow, right? You'll never have gray hair. And so that is something now that several people would be interested in. The dye industry would disappear because if you can drink a tea that makes your hair retain the color that you were born with, can you imagine? But what we
And then
need to
one other industry will just die, right?
exactly. But what we need to secure is the intellectual property rights to that person. Because what happens is, and I think it comes back to our culture, we tend to be very generous and we share our information. And we don't understand the value of of our intellectual property information. So I share a solution with Chantal, and the next thing I know, sorry Chantal to use you as this example. The next thing I know, Chantal has a patent and Chantal is making a bag of money, and I'm still at home without any benefit from the information that I shared with her. So we've
And
also
perhaps I can't even access it either. The person
exactly
pay for it,
no
yes.
what happens usually, is when they get the information, they might send you back a book to say thank you. So you get the book.
Acknowledgement page.
Exactly. And
Yes.
they describe the book and you get the book and that's about it. And you think, wow, they sent me a book. So what we at JIFA have been trying to do in this area is to raise the level of knowledge and information so that people understand that you shouldn't just freely share your information because you're not sure what use is going to, and you may not benefit. I mean, you have a choice. If you want to give the information away, that is fine. But we try to encourage persons to use the intellectual property tools that are there. So you secure your right before you share it so that you can benefit. So I
And
think
really clear, maybe as you speak, I know that Nepal, for example, would do are still doing the material transfer agreements.
yes,
And
they do.
right. So they still do the material transfer agreements. But perhaps even until before we develop the kind of legislative framework that is required, that if communities would know where to go, if somebody comes in a community and are asking questions, how do they deal with it and what do they do? I know,
Okay.
for example, that in Moortown, and I think for most of your Maroon communities, I know many times when you go, even though some of the information is in the public domain, that they are very careful at times the amount of information that you actually receive. Because I believe that in their own rights, they also have developed this knowledge base as to what it is that you
Yes.
should share and what you should not share. And that's why I was saying, I think that public education is very important and that people need to understand that there is an extent to which you can actually benefit from the knowledge that you have. And where are the places that you go if you want to? And how do you preserve this kind of knowledge? How do you benefit from it? how do I how do I obtain the kinds of rights that will allow me to benefit, and the kind of rights that will be my rights against the other rights?
Well, I must say, Lalita, we have done a lot of work with our Maroon communities and with our Rastafarian
Yes,
communities.
I'm aware.
And basically, what we have done is we have encouraged them, even the January 6th celebrations at our compound, we have also encouraged them to say to persons, please do not record, please do not take pictures.
Right.
So we try to encourage them and to teach them what they should do to protect what is theirs. But it is the need to keep repeating the message. But
Yes.
I must say the government of Jamaica has also taken steps to put a law in place, right? And we actually have a document that is now being reviewed by the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, under which NEPA falls. And this basically is going to put in place a law dealing with traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, basically outlining the fact of the rights and the need. And as I was saying that, I should also mention the Institute of Jamaica and the African Caribbean Institute and the Memory Bank.
The memory bank, right.
Memory bank is a repository of our knowledge. So sometimes when people are saying, okay, this is mine, the memory bank can counteract your claim that it is yours because they have documentary evidence to show that really it is not yours. It
Right.
belongs to someone else. But I think we have to be mindful of the fact that when someone alleges something, we shouldn't just throw our arms up in the air, but we should take the time to do the research, and we encourage people to come to Jaipur because we do provide information and we do provide guidance to you as to what steps you can take to protect your intellectual property.
Right.
So perhaps we should open up to see if there are any questions or comments, if anybody is still there.
I see something on the screen that there's a question by Mr. Panton. It just popped up on the screen, so I suppose you're
How can libraries be empowered? Oops. Right. How can libraries be empowered to help communities with geographical indicators that require community and business policy and coordination?
Okay, so what I would encourage the libraries to do, there's a lot of information on geographical indications. In Jamaica, we have the Protection of Geographical Indications Act, which Lalita mentioned in our presentation, which speaks to the fact that any producer or group of producers can make an application to protect something as a geographical indication. And just to say that the government of Jamaica, under the CARIFORUM Economic Partnership Agreement with the European Union, has shared with the European Union a list of potential geographical indications relevant to Jamaica. That list is readily available in terms, and we at JICO can come in and assist you. There's a lot of information available online and in libraries about geographical indications, and we're willing to come in and do a presentation because it is a specific area and persons can read about it, but it's important for them to speak to the IP office so they can get more in-depth information about the geographical indications. And just to say, in Jamaica, we have two geographical indications that are registered under the Protection of Geographical Indications Act. We have Jamaica jerk and we Jamaica rum. We also have coffee that is protected as a certification mark under the trademark law because the Geographical Indications Act is a relatively new law that came into being based on the World Trade Organization agreement on trade related aspects of intellectual property rights. the TRIPS agreement. So we have a specific law protecting geographical indications now. Thank you. Any other questions?
I do believe that the topic needs to be broached with the local communities to document our knowledge in a publicly available repository. Once we can show that initial holding of the knowledge, we have much stronger footing to defend our intellectual property rights. I think that's a comment from Stuart Patton.
Sure, Mr. Patton, thank you for your comment. We actually, as I mentioned earlier, we've actually had a whole series of meetings for over 10 years with members of all the local communities in Jamaica. The recognized local communities being the Rastafarians and the Maroons, but we've also had meetings with all of the people who came that made up Jamaica. So we invited people from all of the communities in Jamaica. We had persons from the Indian community, the Chinese community, the Jewish community. What have I forgotten? The Arabs, yeah, I said the Chinese. So we had everybody sit down, and they actually we had questionnaires that persons filled out, and they also gave us information. There's a challenge from the point of view of intellectual property, and well, the jury is out. When you document your information and you put it down on paper, after a certain amount of time, you lose the rights to that information and it falls into the public domain. So, do you want to document your information so that it is available for everybody to have access to? Or do you want to continue sharing your information by means of the oral tradition and you keeping that documentary evidence to yourself? Or do you want to make it more widely available? The memory bank, the project I spoke to earlier, where we provided cameras to record. So local communities were given the opportunity to document and record their traditional knowledge and to have that repository that they maintain and keep. Or are you suggesting that it should be kept at the national level and allowing persons to have access to it? I'd love to flesh that out some more with you, Mr. Panton. So if you want to get in touch with us and we could have a greater discussion on that, I would appreciate that. You could send an email to info@jipo.gov.jm. Thank you. Any other questions?
There's one from Benjamin Branch that just popped up as well.
Okay, there's a question, another question from Mr. Panton.
How will you broach the issue where Jamaican in traditional knowledge can be linked back to our African roots? As an example, periwinkle is used both in Africa and in Jamaica. However, the initial research came from the fact that the scientists saw periwinkle being used in Jamaica. However, there are clear African roots. The Nagoya Protocol.
Yeah.
I think Mr.
All right, so what we have done is at the level of the Intergovernmental Committee on Traditional Knowledge, on Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge, and Traditional Cultural Expressions, this question has been raised repeatedly. If you look at geographical indications, um, what you get from a periwinkle in Jamaica, you may not necessarily get from a periwinkle in
Exactly.
Ethiopia. And what you get from a periwinkle in St. Elizabeth, you may not necessarily get from a periwinkle that's grown in the Blue Mountains. Because what you have to look at is the total and complete ecosystem, which determines what you get out of the plant. And if you go to the Institute of Jamaica, you will see all of that information documented because it gave it an easy example would be coffee. So the Arabica typica, which grows in the Blue Mountain, gives you Blue Mountain coffee with a specific aroma, taste, odor, the organoleptic properties of the coffee that comes from the Blue Mountain are totally and completely different from the organoleptic properties that come from that same plant that is grown in Manchester. So you have High Mountain coffee and you have Blue Mountain coffee, the same plant, but because of where it is grown and the entire ecological system, you get a different result. So we've looked at that at the Intergovernmental Committee at the World Intellectual Property Organization. And so what we've said is, yes, it could have had its genesis here, but when it was transplanted, you got a different benefit. The other thing is we have the genetic resource, which is the periwinkle. But what did we do with it? How did we take that genetic resource and create it into an end product? So they could have done something totally different in Africa than we did in Jamaica. So you look at not only the genetic resource, but the end result of the genetic resource. Another question?
Yes. Could there be a
Yes.
prototype IP
That,
framework? Okay, that's from
yeah,
Benjamin
that is what we're speaking about at the Intergovernmental Committee of the World Intellectual Property Organization. What we're trying to do is to put a treaty in place that recognizes the intellectual property that is associated with the traditional knowledge, the traditional cultural expressions, and the genetic resources. Basically, what we're trying to do is to have a treaty that persons will link into their local laws where there are no local laws. So, what Jamaica is doing, and a number of other member states of the World Intellectual Property Organization, is to have a law in place that addresses and deals with the issue. There's no international treaty that deals with the issue, which is what they're trying to arrive at. But in the interim, that doesn't prevent member states from putting a law in place. And there are a number of countries that have protocols. There are several protocols dealing with this subject from Africa, from the Andean nations, in Asia Pacific, in Australia and New Zealand. There are quite a few territories. Even in the United States, they recognize to some degree. Some would argue that it is not as extensive as it should be, but there are first steps that have been taken towards putting legislation in place to recognize this. Any other questions? I think that's
I
it.
think that's the question.
Yeah.
Think this was a very comprehensive discussion, and I feel honored and privileged to be amongst Mrs. Davis Mattis and Ms. Bellamy with such great knowledge on intellectual property as well as the environment. So I want to thank all our participants this morning for tuning in. We have another exciting webinar coming up. It is copyright, COVID, and the church. So we'll be promoting as well, Miss Mattis. I see you're excited about that one. So copyright, COVID, and the church is the next topic that we'll be looking at. So we will promote on our website www.jipo.gov.jm, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So thank you so much for participating, and we hope to see you again in our next webinar. Thank you.
And thank you for having me, and all the best to Jaipur. Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Please keep me posted.
Yes, definitely will.
Oh, by the way, there's a question here. I just saw a note here. There is a question that you have.
Oh,
Oh, it's a comment. Oh, thank you.
Thank you
Karen.
very much. Thank you so much. Okay, have a great day. Bye bye.
Thank you.